So I think they're going to start doing...
Yeah.
Yeah, you can crack on.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Frontline Club. Just to remind you to turn your phones to silent, please. And when we get to the question and answers, please wait until the microphone comes around, because we are filming tonight. But now if I can hand over... Oh, sorry, one more thing. This evening was going to be chaired by John Lee Anderson, but unfortunately he is in Crimea at the moment. So we're delighted that Owen Bennett-Jones has managed to step in and take his place. Over to you,
Thank you very much. That's a great pleasure. And thank you all for coming. Now then, as the cameraman here and the stills photographers know, the writers like their bylines and the TV journalists like their datelines, but there are some who actually just do the work without the recognition normally, and the stills photographers probably feel that way sometimes. I hope not tonight, because Bob Nickelsberg has been doing this for many, many years and is a gauge in Afghanistan of when something's going on, because he is always there when something is going on. And he's produced these books. There are 20 here, and the publishers are here and very much hoping that all 20 will go tonight. So let me urge you to take that opportunity. It's heavily discounted tonight. And the great advantage Bob's got is that he's been doing this for so long that he does have the historical knowledge to know what's going on in Afghanistan, what's gone on in Afghanistan, what post 9/11 means, given that he understands what was happening pre 9/11, and we'll discuss some of that when we've gone through the pictures and having a Q&A session. So what's going to happen is we've got 45. How many pictures are in the book?
117.
Yeah. So about half the pictures will be here, and Bob's going to talk us through them for about half an hour. 40 of those 45 images, and then we'll have some Q&A afterwards, which will be between us and then open to the floor. So I think we'll just crack on with what is going to be a chronological set of pictures, and over to you to tell us what's in them.
Thank you, Owen. I think this needs to be a little bit higher. So the impetus for the book came about for a number of reasons. One, total exhaustion in 2009 after making 4 embedded trips to Afghanistan. And number two is a lingering desire to figure it out myself, really, what 25 years or approximate number of years of working in that country. Being based in New Delhi for Time magazine, I covered 6 countries, and before India really was on the map, it was primarily Pakistan and Afghanistan. The countries are very much integrated, and as you will be bombarded with a lot of information tonight from the pictures, to understand Afghanistan, you need to know Pakistan, and to understand Pakistan, you need to know India. And I could see that when I moved to India in 1988. The learning curve was pretty much vertical. Kashmir had not yet started, but the insurgency was definitely on the back burner, and soon enough, with Afghanistan and Pakistan involved in the Soviet era, the Cold War was declining, and small insurgencies in Sri Lanka and Pakistan and India picked up. So
let's just say before you start, if you're standing at the back and want to sit down, just do come and get the seats. They're all here. They're all empty. Anyone else? No? Yep.
In 1988, I realized that with frontline cameramen here in London and in Peshawar that I was way behind as far as covering the mujahideen. So I decided to plug away with visas to Kabul, and I figured that would be the wave of the future, is getting into Kabul. And we begin with the Soviet withdrawal in May of 1988. What's interesting about this image is, and remember context is very important here, the Soviets had killed 1 million people at this point in time in 1988 and displaced 6 million refugees. So this flag from the Afghan soldier being handed to the Russian tank driver leaving in terms of friendship really is a bit ironical. The CIA and the ISI tried to establish a foothold in Afghanistan with making a provincial capital in Kandahar province, and this is a picture from the Battle of Jalalabad in March of 1989. The battle went on for 6 months. It was a failure, and bin Laden was at this particular battle for a number of weeks. This is the shuttle to the front line. It's an interesting group of characters, and you'll notice this fellow up here filming something they're very good at these days, is filming their own battles, as well as suicide attacks. That, by the way, was not present during this period. This represents, for me, a bit of the old phrase of carpet bombing. This is what's happening here in the Battle of Jalalabad. You can see a plane flies very low, and the Afghan Air Force was being flown by some Russians and some Afghans. These are refugees during the Battle of Jalalabad. So back in Kabul, life goes on, and the military academy, which these cadets are part of, was still strong. The Soviets had left behind pretty good institutions, well-funded, well-stocked, and you can see the esprit de corps here, the discipline, which back in 1989 was still there. Eventually, with the city being rocketed on a regular basis, most of these people fled and either joined the mujahideen or left the country. So the Communist Party of Afghanistan was in control under President Najibullah. Now, this is an interesting site. This is Pakistan here. This is in the province of Khost, right on the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan. This is from March of 1991, when the forces controlled by Jalaluddin Haqqani, finally managed to break through and establish a foothold in the province of Khost. This spelled pretty much the disaster and the end of the Kabul regime. Once you establish a state within certainly the underbelly of the country, things are going to pretty much come flying down on you. Now, this is the man himself, Jalaluddin Haqqani, one of the first people to promote global jihad, and he was the first Afghan leader to go to the Middle East, to Jeddah and Mecca, to raise money for training camps and establish himself a very good relationship with Osama bin Laden. I had gone across there with a well-known Afghan journalist, Anthony Davis, looking for proof of Kashmiri militants being trained in one of his camps that was also funded by ISI. He agreed that he did have Kashmiri militants, and along with everyone else from the Middle East and Gulf countries. He also agreed quite nicely to have his picture taken. It's rumored that he is in a nursing home in Karachi. This is the backside of one of his training camps, also built with bin Laden construction equipment and funding. This is also one of the camps that was attacked in 1997 by President Clinton after the U.S. embassies were attacked in Africa. You can see how nicely tucked away it is in one of the draws. This is a captured Russian tank, a couple of them. We didn't get very far in, but we did get to see Al-Qaeda training Afghans. This is a picture of some Arabs with their Afghan recruits in the same area of Jalaluddin Haqqani. One interesting photograph that was never published by Time magazine, where I was a contract photographer, are these two Chinese Uyghur militants being trained on how to disassemble a Kalashnikov. When, interestingly enough, Anthony Davis spoke fluent Mandarin, having grown up in Singapore, he barked at them in Mandarin and flipped them out. And their main excuse was that their parents had a Chinese restaurant in Lahore and that they were there on just a weekend kind of training session. So again, back into Kabul in 1991-92, life goes on. This is a typical scene in Babar Gardens, a Mughal era beautiful park. And on Fridays in Islamic societies, as their day off, the families would go for a picnic. These are men dancing the atan. There's no alcohol, but plenty of smoke. And there's a harmonium and a tabla player off to the right. In March of 1992, the region started to crack, and with the anticipation that Najibullah wouldn't be able to hold, it was getting shaky, so flying in from New Delhi was essential, getting there and staying. In March, it was just 1 month away from when the city fell to the mujahideen. This is a newspaper hawker, probably illiterate, but you can see here a local fellow buying the paper and reading it aloud, which is typical in a developing country when literacy is so low. But this is the only government paper available at the time, completely controlled radio and television and media. So this picture brings forward the ethnic diversity and the importance of trying to organize various ethnic groups. And this is taken in Jabal Siraj in April 10th to be exact. The dates are important here, not only for my own clarity, but for you to understand this very complicated country. This is a press conference being held by Ahmed Shah Massoud, and on April 10th, he was lucky enough to get a defecting General Abdul Rashid Dostum, the Uzbek Minister of Defense. He joined the Mujahideen, and there's another army general here, Momin, who didn't quite get forward enough. But this is a press conference being held to explain to us which ministries are about to go in and take in Kabul, which in the end they didn't explain it with so much detail, but which intersections they were going to take, which buildings they were going to take over, and the reasons for this and the timing. These are Ismailis. This is the leader. This is another Ismaili. So you have Uzbek, Ismaili, Tajik, Panjshiri, all of Massoud's men, another Ismaili. The only people missing here are the Pashtuns, a key group, obviously, and they were not permitted by the Pakistanis to attend this meeting. So Gulbuddin Hekmatyar is a name that's going to come up again. This is the actual takeover of Kabul. Two mad, wild Uzbek fighters keeping away Gulbuddin Hekmatyar forces below Bala Hisar, which is one of the primary landmarks of Kabul, a 16th or 15th century fort. They're holding on to this intersection, and they kept Gulbuddin Hekmatyar out of the city in whichever way they could. So victory came maybe on the 26th of April. It lasted for about a day, and then civil war really kicked in immediately. So there was really this was a very mild victory celebration. This begins chapter 2. In 1993, a civilian caught in crossfire in western Kabul. The civilians bear the brunt of all this. They're pretty much without any defense on their way to get food or send their kids out to school. A typical joyriding group of government soldiers. This is downtown Kabul. The Kabul River runs along here, the length of this photograph. That's the Ministry of Defense over here. And Gulbuddin Hekmatyar was bombarding the city on a regular basis with 107 and 122 millimeter rockets and just blasting the daylights, trying to hit the Ministry of Defense here behind the trees, but usually landing in civilian areas. So you've heard of the expression, grab whatever you can and flee. These are civilians in March of 93 avoiding artillery barrages between competing groups in western Kabul. This is a family, and I noticed this very carefully with a loop once I scanned the image in of what you take when you have to leave quickly. It's a bicycle. This is all one family, by the way. It's a bicycle, a teacup, a chicken, the mother and daughter-in-law, or daughter, probably daughter-in-law, and a bag of food. A lot of violence was happening in downtown Kabul, as well as rations and gasoline not being able to get into Kabul, being held on the Khyber Pass by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, cutting off the UN aid as well as normal items of essentialness, and really the lifeblood of Kabul is food and gasoline. This is a group of workers jumping into a Russian Volga. I stopped counting at 23 people that I imagined to be in this car. This is a normal way of getting to work during the Civil War, when buses were not running. Back to the civilians and the cost that they really, this is a war widow who struggled. Her husband had been killed during the jihad in the early 90s, late 80s. We couldn't get anything specific out of them, but 6 children downtown Kabul. This is the main business district in 1994. The front line being over here where Al-Qaeda, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, and other Pakistani soldiers, roughly 800 yards away, without accuracy here. But mortars were heavily used, and these are government, what we call T-boys, who go out during truces and fetch water and food. This business district has been totally rebuilt today, if any of you have been to Kabul. During one of the lulls, Ray Whitaker and I, a former London Independent reporter, went down with one of the great drivers of Kabul, Amir Shah, in this taxi and encountered these 5. There were 5 living. He's dead at the moment, but they were talking to us, and in the middle of this conversation, a competing group in downtown Kabul came up to them and started screaming and arguing about a television that they had stolen from them. In other words, looted. And they settled the argument by just lowering the rifle and shooting this fella in the stomach. In 1993, I came across a group of executed Hizbi Wadat soldiers. They're the main Shia group supported by Iran. They had been executed. And in this period of time, there was a bad human rights violation massacre of 800 Shia up in this neighborhood of Kabul. This is in western part of the city. And the bodies were just dumped. And about 2 weeks before, I figured 10 to 14 days, the dogs hadn't gotten to them yet. But they were clearly the Hizbi Wadat, most likely killed by Sunni competitors of either Sayaf or Rabbani soldiers, competing for various neighborhoods in this area of western Kabul. It's still a human rights case pending, and Human Rights Watch did an amazing report of the massacre. We now move to the 3rd chapter. This is Taliban firing at retreating Massoud forces north of Kabul. 2 Taliban fighters with a 107 millimeter Chinese rocket coming out of here. You can see how their uniforms really are as basic as you can get. This is when the whip really came down in Kabul with the Taliban takeover in October of 1996. This is a mad mullah. I had numerous encounters with this guy out on the front line, basically reading Kabul people the riot act of what's going to happen now that they have full control of the country. That beards will be grown, prayers will be attended 5 times a day, shops must close, girls will no longer be educated, schools will close, and turbans and proper dress and civilian conduct will be monitored very, very closely. Now, Kabul people, this fella is from Kandahar, so the accents, as in any country, are completely different from one neck of the woods to the other across the country. Kandahar accent is easily recognizable in Kabul, and they dislike each other intensely. Even though they now have control, this is the 10 Commandments pretty much being laid out for them. This is what the Taliban did on their way into Kabul from Kandahar. This is the university on the outskirts of Kandahar, destroyed. In 1997, there was a deal cut with the Taliban moving their way up north of Herat on the western part of the country into Mazar-e Sharif. This is the famous Blue Mosque in Mazar-e Sharif. This was an odd deal cut by an Air Force general to push out General Dostum, his competitor. And as a small footnote to this, Uzbeks, who these people are here on the left, are they don't get along with Pashtuns at all. They never have. And this is a very strange agreement about to be cut here. Uzbeks signing over their part of Balkh province to the Taliban. This is the Minister of the Interior. These are all Pashtuns. Pashtuns and Uzbeks do not get along. Plus the appearance. Uzbeks, being more Mongol, Central Asian types, cannot grow beards, and Pashtuns who have nothing but beards and turbans and a dislike for Uzbeks and non-Pashtun people. So this agreement lasted 36 hours. It broke down after the Taliban decided they wanted to disarm the local population, which is something in Afghanistan you never try to do. So a fight broke out, and actually the Taliban were sucked in on the road to the airport. And two other journalists, Robert King, who many of you know from a movie that was done here from the Frontline People, and Dean Johnson from, I think it was ITN at the time, we were caught in this. So somebody walked across, a local guy, and went into this shop and turned around and just opened fire on the Taliban, including us. And this fellow came across, and this is the moment he's been hit. Shots came out of this shop front here. He's thrown back about 10, 12 feet. And you can see this is the main road to the airport. All these are Taliban people just standing completely surprised. Shots were coming in from all the rooftops. He goes down. This fellow walks away. There he is. We pulled back a little bit. He's carried out after firing an RPG into the doorway, which is very effective. And then 36 hours later, 800 Taliban had been massacred. So Phil Goodwin's in the room. He was also stuck with us in an ICRC clinic, and we couldn't get out. Our rooftop was being used, but all of the Taliban who had come up to Mazar-i-Sharif were killed. And this, if many of you know the way Afghanistan functions, revenge is about to be used against them. And the following year, a couple of thousand of locals were killed in retaliation for this. These are dead Taliban being stacked up. We move forward to February 2001. Again, we're now 7 months away from 9/11. And the Taliban had been through a lot of issues with the world. I forget when the Bamyan Buddhas were bombed, but soon, or at least around this time, I believe, they were blown up. So they really got nasty with UN organizations not allowing food, fuel, and medicine into refugee camps because of a bad drought up north on the outskirts, or out west, in the outskirts of Herat. And this is a baby that succumbed to flu because they couldn't find shelter. So this is something that I was working for the New York Times at that particular moment. And this is the funeral sort of cortege, and it's traditional. This is the father of the 6-month-old baby being carried to the grave. And this is a refugee camp that the Taliban had refused any of the humanitarian aid from getting in. In May of 2001, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda had 90% control of Afghanistan. And Tony Davis and I decided we wanted to figure out how the remaining 10% how they sustained themselves under Ahmad Shah Massoud. We made our way through the front lines and got up to the Panjshir Valley. And Massoud, at that time, gave us a couple of days. He and Tony were good friends from the 80s. And he claimed to know that something was going on in Kandahar with Al-Qaeda and bin Laden. He had spies around there, but obviously ethnically they don't fit in. Tajiks, he's an ethnic Tajik, and Pashtuns. He tried to get the CIA interested in helping out. There were some people that were interested in starting funding again for Massoud, but at this point, with 90% of the country under Taliban Al-Qaeda control, it looked pretty much dicey for him to get any traction. But he had the only functioning lapis lazuli mine, and he had 2 or 3 emerald mines, which helped supply him with some financial backing. Those stones and minerals were smuggled out through Tajikistan or Pakistan over to Dubai. The Russians were also helping out with fuel and helicopter parts, but this is in Hoja Bahudin. Many of you who covered the post 9/11 attack on Afghanistan went in through Tajikistan, Dushanbe, and into Hoja Bahauddin. But again, it's important. Now we're 4 months away from 9/11. 9/11 has happened. This picture is from end of November in 2001. I was working with the New York Times out in Quetta, Baluchistan, western Pakistan, and got a visa with 20 other journalists, Pakistanis and foreigners, and we got into, the Taliban wanted to show us the damage that American and NATO planes had done to Kandahar city, and they also wanted to take us out to a village that had been leveled by bombing because the West thought that they were Al-Qaeda and Taliban taking refuge there. But these are all Taliban. They're not very happy to see us. We had lots of security. This is in the money market of Kandahar. This is the picture that's a cover of the book, but this is the village that the Taliban wanted to take us to. We found 17 graves, the village, just adobe huts and no electricity. The Americans claimed to have seen a lot of lights on the ground and figured these must be Al-Qaeda. Who else would have generators and be hiding in the middle of nowhere, about a 2-hour drive from Kandahar city? This is an interesting shot in that it's the cover of the book, and when I proposed the dummy to the publisher, it lasted. Usually the publisher and the artist go into a big argument about what's going to be the cover, but and you can see he's calling in his children. He's a shepherd calling in the goats and the sheep from the outer areas to come home. But this is the result of bombing, all this broken brick and blasted soil. But somebody once said, well, no, that's actually a CIA agent dressed as a shepherd calling in an airstrike. But I didn't think that was too relevant, but it's still pretty funny in a sick way. So in December of 2001, these jolly-looking fellows, 4 Pakistani Jaish-Mohammed fighters from Punjab and Pakistan, were captured by the victorious Northern Alliance soldiers and were being held in one of the royal estates outside of Kabul and eventually interrogated and probably turned back over to Pakistani authorities. But they did agree to our questions that yes, they were who they claim they were. They're from Jaish-Mohammed, trained in Faisalabad in Punjab, and from a madrasa. Tora Bora, in mid-December of 2001, bin Laden had already escaped over the mountain, and this is the some of the unlucky guys who were left behind to keep the path clear for the Americans, the few special forces and Afghan militia that were hired to go and chase bin Laden. This is a Yemeni or a Saudi Al-Qaeda, totally shell-shocked, having been up in the mountains for over 2 weeks on the receiving end of any number of bombs from F-16s, B-1 bombers. And this is another Al-Qaeda fellow being brought out. It's not legal to present prisoners to the press, and but they don't really care about those kinds of things. And they were probably sold to the Americans and one of the first residents of Guantanamo. This begins the American participation, and this is the first picture of the 4th chapter. This is in central Afghanistan, in the Shahikot Valley. A big battle took place here between Al-Qaeda and Taliban fleeing southwest of Kabul. This is a soldier, U.S. Army soldier from the 10th Mountain Division. We're at about 5,500 feet, and this is a dead Taliban. The face has already been sort of disfigured from maggots, so I had to figure out a way to get an acceptable picture. When I got down on one knee, I noticed that there were sets of rubber gloves here. And in fact, editing the book out, I noticed another set. But what really got my attention were the blue ink on, on this fellow's fingertips. So some forensic team had been through and fingerprinted a dead guy. It still to this day doesn't make any sense, but the body's pretty well preserved. One of the impetuses for me was, in the beginning of putting this book together, was to bring in the various countries that surround Afghanistan and the effects that these countries have on that country's history and destiny. And this is these are Afghans in Quetta, something denied by the Pakistanis, that they were giving sanctuary to the Taliban. But during the winter months, Taliban traditionally go to Pakistan and hang out, wait till the winter passes and the snows in the passes melt. And here they are in an area called Pashtunabad. This is in Quetta. In 2008, I visited a rather remote part of Nuristan, and again, one of the advantages of being on an embed is that you can go to places that you normally wouldn't be able to reach on your own or even with a good four-wheel drive vehicle. These are 3 soldiers from the 10th Mountain Division who had been ambushed, resupplying a base way up in this region. This is an interesting river that runs through, and why the Americans had a base at this particular low point. Eventually they had to give up this area. They were surrounded by 200 to 300 Taliban and blasted out of there. They gave it up. But these fellows were hit by an RPG and lightly wounded, and here's a Black Hawk helicopter that came in to fly them out. Our man in Afghanistan, Zalmay Khalilzad, is the U.S. ambassador, originally from Afghanistan. He left the country when he was 15. This is a shot of him with his security guards, trigger pullers, as they're called, from DynCorp. And this is the Kandahar Airport, which was built by the Americans from 56 to 62. And the Kandahar Airport is one of the primary strategic bases that the Americans and NATO forces expanded on, and something that they don't want to give up. Khalilzad went on to, or came from Iraq as the U.S. ambassador. He may have gone on from Afghanistan, but he's an interesting character, part of the neocon group in Washington, put in power by Wolfowitz and part of the Kissinger crowd, but an interesting fellow. He's back in Washington at the moment. Geography plays a big role in Afghanistan, particularly as media. You have to keep up with these, or at least I did, keep up with the Marines. This is in Kunar. This is the Kunar River in the Hindu Kush, outside of Asadabad, which is the provincial capital. Again, a province favored by Al-Qaeda. A lot of them disappeared and married into different villages, and it's also comes right up against Pakistan and is now a difficult province to control as Al-Qaeda and Lashkar-e-Toiba, another militant group, creep into this very remote and rural province. But you can imagine what it's like. Many of you have worked on embeds to walk up a hill at 6,000 feet wearing all this gear and armor and not being winded at the end of it. So in 2009, this is a press conference of President Hamid Karzai. In 2009, working with the New York Times, went out to Ghazni province, and this to me sort of epitomizes what, again, it's a few years ago, but at that time, really what Afghanistan is going to be left with. And this is a district center manned by Afghan National Police, ANP. You'll see here a brand new Ford pickup truck, a HESCO wall, a great British product, an Afghan flag, a rooftop from a Chinese or an Afghan Jeep, a broken chair, an unused traffic cone, dirty socks, and 2 very hospitable Afghan policemen inviting me in for breakfast. Well, these Ford pickup trucks, there were 11 or 12 of them, but no gasoline. The gasoline had been siphoned off on the way down from Kabul onto the black market, and that includes also spare parts if they ever need a clutch or any kind of fuel or tires or brake pads, whatever. Never makes it down to these central provinces. 80% controlled by the Taliban in this district. So it's a difficult situation, and when people ask me, or you, Owen, for that matter, what's going to happen in Afghanistan, when you actually look at this scene, how can you come up with an answer, no matter how clairvoyant you may be? On the civilian level, this is a soldier being greeted by a local teenager in Wardak province, one of the orneriest provinces of Afghanistan and a gateway into Kabul. You can see how much of this soldier's body is covered. And this is an old trench from the 1980s that was used to fire upon the Soviet army in Jalalabad, which is a very dicey part of Wardak on the outskirts of Kabul. In 2009, I had the unlucky misfortune of being thrown into Helmand province in August, where temperatures reach 50 degrees. And this is a Marine patrol in southern Helmand at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. You can see everyone is totally exhausted and soaked with sweat. They're having an after-action report here after a 4-hour patrol. And when this picture was published in the New York Times, I sent a screen grab of it to the first sergeant that was in control of this Marine base here. And he said, "Thank you very much. We heard about this picture, but we heard about it from a Marine sergeant major in the Pentagon who reamed them a new one because these guys were out of uniform. Do-rags, which keep the sweat out of your eyes." So somebody sitting in the Pentagon in a well-air-conditioned climate gets on the pipe and reams these guys out for being out of uniform. It didn't go really very far. They just basically, you can tell what a Marine would say to some comment like that. They filled a couple of sandbags and went on about there, but they were fully informed. Now, this is an interesting picture of the Hindu Kush, back from the same area that I showed before of the Marine climbing up. That's that very mountainous area at 7,000, 8,000 feet. This was taken from an American helicopter of a colonel coming in to check out his area on a turnover of forces. And all of the bases that were, small bases that were dotting this geography were given up by General McChrystal and General Petraeus as being too difficult to resupply, to get wounded out, particularly with difficult cloud cover. And again, part of Kunar, anyone thinks that they can control this kind of geography, it's maddening. This is another idea of terrain at zero elevation back in southern Helmand, just to give you an idea of the different and the variety of terrain in Afghanistan. This is a Marine in Khan Nishin. This is a Marine patrol checking out a farmer's supply of fertilizer and seed, looking for IED making materials, which is made with plant fertilizer, ammonium nitrate, mixed in a bucket with diesel fuel, and it makes that lethal thing called an IED. It was determined that this farmer did not have those ingredients, but just had normal seed and fertilizer. So we're up to, that was in 2009, we're up to 2013, last year in May, when I went out to finish taking pictures for the book. I had given the wish list to a base in Logar, Shank. It's a popular collecting point for material that's going to be taken out of the country. And I knew that they had been launching drones in this base, and I never thought that they would say yes, but they did. They allowed me on. These are not armed drones. These are purely for reconnaissance. But this is the launch pad. They're thrown out there. It's already reached 80 miles an hour at this point, and they stay up for 6 hours, primarily to monitor the main Route 1 highway that leads from Kandahar into Kabul. They stay flying for 6 hours at 6,000 feet. And really, the optics on these things are just incredible. But I also gave the Army a story for their daily paper by requesting this. They themselves didn't know that this was a story. But the armed drones take off from Kandahar and other bases. They don't allow any media access to that. So the collecting points for arms and vehicles that are being sent out of the country, this is an enormous hangar at Bagram Air Base. These MRAPs, they're called, mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles made by Oshkosh, $750,000 vehicles, 12 to 15 tons. This Army soldier is looking throughout all the crevices that may have caught a stray bullet before they're shipped out. And all of this netting equipment will be stripped down, and they'll either be driven out or flown out. At that point in time, Pakistan had closed the border to exit for the land route to Karachi. But you can see what equipment the Americans had if you count the number of vehicles and $750,000 per vehicle. I wanted to show really what the present-day Kabul was all about, and I had barely 5 days to do that. This is a wedding hall, very much like the Middle East and Dubai, that kind of bling that they all love. And this is a wedding hall that has 4 chambers in it. Most weddings that from the middle and upper classes of Kabul will hold 400 to 600 people. This is really what Kabul aspires to. This gives you a view of western Kabul on the development. It's a city that was designed for 500,000 and now has 4 to 6 million. It's jammed, and I expect that this property along the Kabul River will be gone in a couple of years, this farmland. This was the front line where the picture of the civilian crossing. This is Demozang traffic intersection. The Kabul Zoo is over here on the right. And this is primarily the Shia Hazara area. This is Kabul University. And that picture of the massacre of the dead bodies, I tried to find it in 2013. It's in a very built-up area. It's over here. Kabul University is still functioning. That's really the future of Afghanistan. So on May 16th, my last day in Kabul, I had an afternoon flight to Dubai. At 9 o'clock, after I paid my hotel bill, I was told that there had been a suicide car bomb attack near Bala Hisar in downtown Kabul, and sure enough, 2 Chevrolet Suburban vehicles packed with 4 trainers and 2 probably former military and 2 serving military American soldiers were killed, rammed by a car packed with explosives. It killed 6 Americans and 10 Afghans and ruined this whole block. This is what happens if you take the same route over and over again. They'll eventually find you. And as many of you may have heard about today, a Swedish journalist was killed at midday in downtown Kabul. So risk to all of us continues, but particularly the cost is borne by the civilians. Now, we started with the Soviet withdrawal. This is the beginning of what the military likes to call retrograde. It's another word for withdrawal. But this is at Bagram Air Base, one of the bases that they do not want to give up. It's enormous. And these are American soldiers, Army soldiers going out, no weapons, and these are Army soldiers coming in to finish their deployment. I also noticed this guy was giving me a little hand signal here. If anybody knows who he is, I'll sell him a book, maybe. I don't know. Girls' schools, there are some very positive things that have happened since 2001. Girls' literacy is certainly up. Girls are going to school. This is a crossing guard stopping traffic for girls. You can see a couple of them really didn't want to have their picture taken, but generally they're very happy to be in school. And while the rural areas, it's not so much the case, a lot of girls have gone back to school. Education across the country has improved. This is the final slide, and this is what Kabul aspires to. It's a bustling, loud, dusty, chaotic market in western Kabul. This is really what they want. They don't want the violence. They don't want the fighting. They're sick of it. They want to be able to get their cars out into a market, get stuck in traffic. And shops are open. There's a lot of activity. People are working. But, of course, the they're very much dependent on this war economy and will suffer with rising prices and rising unemployment numbers as well. But this really, if violence were to leave Afghanistan, this would be a normal, everyday picture. It is, to a certain extent, but with uncertainty about its future and a reminder about their past. This was a Chevrolet Suburban. Why the Americans continue to use those cars that are automatic targets. I mean, who else would be driving a Chevrolet Suburban in Afghanistan but American soldiers? It's insane. So with that upbeat thought, that is the end of the slide projection. And we're going to take some questions from you. Please feel free to ask.
Well, it is an amazing body of work. And so just a few questions from me. And it seems to me the obvious point is your grip of the politics and what's going on is pretty deep. And I wonder how difficult it is to do that when you're trying to take pictures. I mean, to be gathering this understanding of what's going on around you and who all the groups are and who all the politicians are and what's going on. I mean, is that a tension?
I had to do it in India, I had to do it in Pakistan, I had to do it in Nepal, I had to do it in Sri Lanka and Bhutan, if we ever got there. I mean, that's what you have to absorb when you work in that region. It's all integrated. And then to go home from Afghanistan, Kashmir was picking up. And all of a sudden we started getting, in 1989, in Kashmir is just 90 minutes from Delhi, where I was based. All of a sudden, Kalashnikovs started appearing in Kashmir. Where did they come from? The Indians don't use Kalashnikovs. They came from Afghanistan. Now, when the Soviets left, and not to belabor you with more details, but they left 7 million Kalashnikovs behind, 4 million packed in Greece, and 3 million loose Kalashnikovs. In Pakistan, the rivalry between the two countries was, which certainly what I was concerned about, showed up in Kashmir. The rivalry was all over the place. So to stay there for that long and to get everything clear, not just for myself, but also for magazine editors who didn't know much about this, and at the end of the Cold War, it was a fascinating time to be there.
But have you ever written as well as taking the pictures? Or have you ever wanted to? Because you've obviously...
I'm a poor writer.
Right.
I can do this better verbally than I can on paper, but I rely on friends who do it better than I, certainly.
Can I just ask you about... I mean, you've been doing it for so long in the same area. How much more difficult is it to operate now compared to 20 years ago?
It's extremely difficult. Mobility is your biggest thing in Afghanistan, getting from A to B. And with the U.S. out, there's no longer the helicopter travel just around the corner. That Camp Shank that I visited, where the drone was taking off, is a 2-hour drive. It's not recommended that you make that. So security is the biggest issue right now.
But I mean, how is it deteriorating? When you talked about that Swedish journalist today, it seems to me it is getting genuinely difficult now just to even be in Kabul, possibly. I mean, obviously you can go to Kabul, but I mean, moving around is difficult.
A fellow friend here we were talking about that this evening. I think you can go and function in Kabul on your own. You have to, anytime you work in this region, you have to be aware of the unexpected. But you don't jump up and down and point fingers at yourself. You try to keep a low profile, and you try to not have an armored vehicle or drive around in a Chevrolet Suburban.
But as the Americans leave, for the journalists, one of the issues will be how that impacts moving around, and it's bound to be more difficult. It'll go back to those Civil War days.
Yes, that's a warning that I really want to bring through in the book, that if you forget the past, particularly pre-9/11, actually post 9/11 happens just by flipping the page. It just happened in a blur. The essential material that you need to come away from this region is what happened before 9/11. The Americans lowered their flag in January of 1991 at the embassy. It was insane to do that. I happened to be there. I was still to this day can nearly cry thinking about what they did. The Soviets had already left. Why are the Americans bringing down the flag? You don't think people notice about that, particularly Iran. And the Russians watch that very closely, and Pakistan. So all these players in the great game of Afghanistan, these things help you as a journalist decide when you're going to make your next trip and actually make some sense of what you're looking at.
And just one more from me, the embedded journalism. So you've done quite a bit of that, and there's a lot of discussion, obviously, for the written press and TV as to how much impact that has editorially on journalists and so on. How do you find it taking stills? I mean, I guess it just gives you access, and there's not really a downside, or is there a downside?
Well, you're only working 50% of the story.
Yeah.
But the other side doesn't permit you access. So what are you going to do? Stay at home? No. You're going to take it. But as a, for a writer, it's a little bit different on how you gather material from a soldier or an officer. But for me, I can keep quiet and just keep looking around for more interesting things to build up. I've been doing it since the early 80s when I started working in El Salvador. And the U.S. denied that they had 300 advisors there. Not true. They had them. So I wanted access to them back then in the 80s. I've been trying to deal with the post-Vietnam syndrome of the media versus the government for a long time. And it's a subtle thing. I have no problem with what the soldiers want to do. I'm going to document it, though.
Great. Well, we've got a microphone. How many have we got? One. Just great. So wait for the microphone. Two. And is there someone else who can hand them out, actually, because it does speed it along a bit. Okay, you'll do that. You'll do both. Okay, so you're very quick at the back, so we're going to go there first of all. And you also got a question. And so just there, yeah. And it probably helps you if you announce yourselves, so Bob knows who you are. And there's one down here. Yeah.
Hi, Ann Jolis, Wall Street Journal. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. Two quick ones. Relating to the Bagram 2013 photos and the MRAPs, I've heard anecdotal stories that since 2011, the Americans have actually been building up huge new structures just to give themselves the infrastructure to get a lot of this stuff out of the country. I don't know if you saw any evidence of that new buildup for the retrograde phase or not. And also, among all these photos, if you could make sure that President Obama stared at one really hard for a good 30 seconds at least, which would it be?
To get access to the Bagram base for the withdrawal, it's the equivalent of an embed. So in other words, you have to prepare your application in such a way that you don't ask for any kind of patrolling, security-related, going down to the border, any kind of base turnover to the Afghans, nothing. You have to word your application, use the word retrograde. It's bizarre, but that's those in the drawdown. If you apply that way, they will grant you without asking you to rewrite your application. So I did see as much as I could, and the base is huge. It's like 3 JFK, it's enormous. 20,000 people live at Bagram. So I didn't see this, but again, what we were usually faced with was how are you going to get those trucks out of there? And they wanted to drive them out through Pakistan. So that was their big challenge, not gearing up. Yes, they did have a bunch of logisticians there, and these people speak in acronyms, and it's foreign language. If you ever can record them, it's actually very interesting. It's a Monty Python dialogue with logisticians. That's all they talk about, is everything is an acronym. So I kind of just gave that a miss. But I'd say for Mr. Obama, stare at Mr. Haqqani for a little while. That's the image that pretty haunting for me. He's still alive, and so are his sons.
Some. I think just before we get to the next question, you've seen some of this infrastructure going in, have you?
Yeah, I was down in Kandahar early last year, and I was making a film called Drawdown, because that was the terminology you had to use to get in there. Sorry, the film Drawdown to get in. That was the terminology that had to be used. And there was a new base that had been built in Kandahar, which was so the Americans were again drawing out of Panjwai and all of the places that they'd fought so hard for years to take. And there was a new base. I can't remember the name of it now. It might have been called Airborne actually, but it was basically just an area for collecting trucks. And I've actually photographed MRAPs being lifted up onto the back of tow trucks to be moved further, probably down to Kandahar Airfield.
They had gathering areas.
Yeah.
But not new bases that I could see.
Okay. Yeah.
As a writer, I can say you don't need to write because the intelligence you brought to those pictures was make them great pictures. I mean, that's astonishing. To be difficult here, we're both Americans. Let's talk about something that has been a kind of a sub-debate here. When David McKilcullen was here, still, I think, an advisor in Betrayus down in Chatham House, he said that there were already 6 civil courts run by the Taliban then, and that I've heard Le Monde Diplomatique saying that they're only legitimate government that we will end up for sure with the Taliban. After I was in some quotes, and BBC actually censored me for making those kind of comments about the Taliban. How did you feel about it, face to face with it? Are the Taliban the legitimate government? They've been running this whole thing for some time now already, just waiting for everybody to get out?
The people don't want them, but they also don't want soldiers around either. They're like a magnet. If the Taliban are there, so are the drones. If the drones leave, the Taliban come in, the people can't stand their doctrine. This is not about ideology anymore. It's about control of regions. And it's understood that the border areas along Pakistan, Afghanistan area they've already cut deals on these particular provinces. Nobody wants to die, particularly the Afghans that are stationed out there. And if they don't have helicopters to come in and help them with artillery, obviously they're going to sign a deal in that part of Paktika, Nangarhar, Helmand, Farah. They're going to go, but they're also going to continue planning Poppy. So it's a mixed bag. But the Taliban really, who's interviewed them recently? We don't know what they're up to. But I think geographically those areas are going to fall.
And Kabul?
It'll stay
And
with the government. They can't really. They can poll barely 10% in an election. The Taliban, the warlords. What about them?
Will the Taliban take care of them?
Well, one just died the other day. They're part of the landscape.
Okay, there's one here.
Hi there. Great slides. When you were speaking, you mentioned one of the leaders getting funding from Emerald Mines, and it reminded me of a news item I saw on one of the American networks. And on that network, it said something on the lines of $1 trillion, this is about 3 or 4 years ago, about $1 trillion worth of minerals have been found in Afghanistan. And I was wondering, it was never in the English media press. It happened to be in the US one. And I was wondering if you managed to actually see any of them, whether they're functioning, or if you have any photographs of those particular areas.
I did make it to the Lapis mine, and I did make it to the Emerald mines. But Afghans and gemology or mining, they really haven't gotten into techniques of not using dynamite. So you might be given a 20-carat ruby. There's some industrial ruby mines there in Jaji, Nangarhar, but it's entirely shattered underneath. So if you hold it up to a light, it may be 20 carats total, but they blast everything. They need, foreign instruments and proper mining technique. But yes, I'm sure it's there. Copper, I hear the Chinese are looking. Right, but they're thinking about Pakistan now. They're not going to. There's no security around that copper area.
It's supposed to be loaded with uranium and a whole vast amount of minerals in Afghanistan. It's supposed to be quite a wealthy area under the mountains.
Right.
I've heard. But.
There's a question there. Yeah.
Hi, I actually have a couple of quick questions. The first one is, how have conditions either improved or deteriorated for the local civilians, not just in Kabul, but in some of the rural areas? And the second question is, you've obviously been there for quite a long time now. You've seen the Soviets leave, you've seen the West come and I guess, go now. What should be the lesson in all this?
I'll address the second question first. Be careful of what you wish for. Remain engaged in this country. Don't disengage. Participate. Watch. Mentor, whatever it takes. But don't leave. Otherwise, history will repeat itself. And Iran would like to see us leave completely. Why not? I mean, in 2003, we were on both sides of Iran, Iraq and Afghanistan. So they're now trying to build a port that would open up Afghanistan Sherbahar. And on a port, Afghanistan is landlocked. They need to import, and they don't really want to deal with Pakistan, for instance. But the future really needs to be an economic one. In the villages, I think there were a lot of hopes and expectations, but there's a lot of regret now about what the Americans didn't accomplish. And this goes all the way back to what Donald Rumsfeld said, that we're not there to rebuild this country. That was one of the worst things he could have ever have said publicly. He may say that privately, but we're not into nation building, is what he said. That was really quite foolish. Again, a signal sent out there. So I think there have been some good things in the villages, but again, security is the main issue.
And over the years you've been going, when have been the best periods for civilians in terms of just being able to live their lives securely, safely?
2004, 2003, you could drive to Kandahar and drive back at night from Kabul. You could drive to places.
And before 9/11?
It was a mess.
There's one here. Yeah.
You mentioned briefly your concentration on documentation. I'm sure you have opinions about the powers that have been at play in Afghanistan. Is there ever tension between those opinions and your documentation? And if so, how do you overcome that tension?
As a photographer, I'm supposed to be the silent one. Reporters do the Q&A kind of thing, but I really deal more with the civilian side. That's what keeps drawing me back, are the Afghans that I've known and worked with for so long, as well as Indians or Pakistan for that matter. It's the everyday life thing that I'm trying to document. At one point in time in Islamabad, that was the best route in, from New Delhi to Islamabad, Peshawar, across. That way you were briefed on what was going on in Afghanistan, because India is not contiguous. You needed to really be in Pakistan. The last place, is not a very cynical thing, but it's just an observation. The last place I went for information was the U.S. Embassy. I just didn't, what's going on here? You have to go as a reporter. You go there, plus it's air conditioned and there's Cokes and there's hamburgers. But it really, I'd rather go to the Canadian Embassy or the Kiwis. The New Zealanders had better information about Afghanistan, or more, for me at that point, credible. So I just, and there aren't, there's a lot of talent and skill in these embassies. But if you're just going to take 5 master's students from Princeton and throw them into the State Department and call them your experts, it's insanity. They never go to the country and get out. The Swiss have diplomats that can go out of their embassy and drive around. That's risky. But Americans, it's very dangerous now to go out of the embassy. So that's my personal overall view of where, yes, I'm trying to document clarity, or I'm a storyteller also, so I'm trying to do a day in the life of a country. You're obviously going to get tripped up by your own emotions.
There's one at the back. Okay, I'll take one down here first then. Yep. And then there's one right at the back. Yeah.
You said a couple of interesting things. First of all, you said we shouldn't leave, i.e. we, you, because, you need to be looking at it and monitoring it, all that. And then you say that the American embassy don't know anything. And then it makes me wonder, because I heard on Newsnight once they were talking about...
I didn't say they don't know anything.
No, but you... Oh, sorry, I thought you did.
No. I just found that I didn't want to go there for the information.
Oh, I see. I'll say they do know stuff. I just wonder about the sort of historical context, because you've talked about sort of 20 years, but in fact, the wars in Afghanistan have been going on for 200 years, ever since the British drew the borders and named it Afghanistan. So I just wonder whether American soldiers, when they go, American diplomats, they ever look at it in that context, in that really long historical context.
A soldier goes there for 2 years, and a diplomat would often just go there for 2 years. And you really get to understand a country after, say, 15 months. And the remaining time that you're there, you prepare yourself to leave. So that knowledge you've gained in your exposure to a country doesn't go very far, and then the next person comes in. And you need to stay there for a long time and watch, be an observer. Different embassies handle their turnover differently, but I just wonder, and again, to get into the American embassy today could take you 2 hours sometimes, just through security and waiting, or probably less. But I don't really want to have to go to that embassy to deal with that rigorous entry. I can apply myself better out in a mad traffic jam, actually, and stand up and take pictures. But gaining knowledge of the place is difficult. And I haven't found a diplomat yet who isn't challenged by that particular region. There are 6-foot thick walls at the U.S. Embassy, or 4-foot thick walls, and tiny windows, and bomb-proof ceilings, and yet they complain about not being able to get out. So how do you absorb? I'm sure some people do go out, and yes, I do like to engage people at embassies, because they have a depth of knowledge that at least reading documents and off-the-record kind of briefings are very helpful to journalists. But I just wonder how far it's going to be able to go if security becomes the main issue.
And how about this much longer look at historical context?
Yes.
They think it sort of started.
The question is how much. What about this much broader historical perspective? Do people have that?
I think people, there aren't any clairvoyants here, nor in embassies, but a lot of countries have an interest in determining the future of Afghanistan, and they're participating.
Okay, there's a question at the back. Yeah.
Mine's Philip Doyne. I'm not a journalist, I'm just a member here. And question almost similar. Can Afghanistan ever be what either the Afghans would like or any of the interested parties, presumably the Russians, the Americans, the Iranians, can it ever be what any of them or all of them would like it to be?
It's really not one country, it's probably 5 or 6 different, almost balkanized in a way, based on ethnicity and regional priorities. And I think that's the way you have to look at it. Afghans don't like central government. They've never been particularly fond of the people from Kabul. Karzai has been called the mayor of Kabul, really, not the president of the country. And there's tribal rivalries which take precedence over a vote, for instance. They are beginning to understand what the value of a vote might be, but does that unify them? Not necessarily. And fragmenting violence actually enhances ethnic solidarity. So what you end up, if you create chaos, you just get everyone to group together, and then they don't really want to look at Kabul anymore. They just want to protect themselves. So I don't know how that country's really going to manage as one particular country. They have a great cricket team.
So there's really no hope of it changing from what's been happening for the last hundreds and hundreds of years?
It's day by day. For me, it's not really a clear answer for you, but with one Swedish journalist getting killed today, why would I want to go tomorrow? I mean, in a way, but you still have to persist and be curious and remain aggressive with your interest.
I don't know whether you'd agree. I could just add to that. I mean, apart from the internal divisions, I mean, when you say these outside powers all have their objectives, but the point is they conflict. And they always have done, and there are regional powers who all want different things. And that is now going to come to the fore when the Americans leave, and it's going to be very difficult.
So it's more of the same.
Yeah, hi. A purely technical question. Going back to the photos you took in the 80s and 90s, what kind of film did you use, or which one did you like the most?
They were all transparencies, so Kodachrome or Ektachrome, the best ones. Kodachrome maintains its life longer than Ektachrome. But again, I had a lot of the film in high temperature areas, so a lot of film would fade over time.
Is the mic loud enough, just to be clear? You're hearing okay at the back? Yeah. So, anyone come back on that? You?
No, just curious, because I mean, I was looking at the photos of like Stephen McCurry, and you look at those kind of colours, and I was just looking at the photos that you took, and there was kind of a similarity there. So I just thought I'd confirm it. Well,
yeah.
Hi, come back to the photography again. Can you tell us about any particular photograph that you didn't take or couldn't take for whatever the reason, whether it's a technical reason or ethical reason, and just maybe tell us a little bit about the photograph that sticks in your mind? I know every photojournalist sort of has one that they couldn't take for whatever reason.
The hardest period of time was working under the Taliban, when you'd arrive with a wish list and automatically be given a minder from the foreign ministry, and they would pretty much control how your day, week, month went on your visa. And that varied from trip to trip, but I could see a lot of missed opportunities there with very grumpy, narrow-minded, or just quirky Taliban that didn't really know how to deal with foreigners and what media was all about. They didn't really have that kind of exposure in the madrasas. But sometimes you got a good guy and you made some progress. But very often, the photo editor back at Time in New York would say, what are we going to get out of this? We know the reporter can report, but the photographer, with photography being prohibited, as soon as you raise a camera, there'd be people in front of you, or not. So that was probably the most frustrating time.
But you could take pictures of inanimate objects.
Yes, like a bus.
Yeah.
Hi, great set of photos. I was just wondering, I noticed that your photos are quite subtle. They're not as extreme, but they really make a point. I was just wondering, do you think that photojournalism, especially in sort of a war sense, has got more and more extreme? I mean, if you look at the press photographer, those are some really, not vulgar, but some really hard-hitting images. Do you think that is a trend that we now see? It's more harsher and harsher and harsher image.
Well, you want to get people's attention, and that depends on the particular style of a photographer or their editor or what they decide to publish. So I'm not quite sure I can answer that, really. You know, at the time, working for an American publication is different than having an editor, say, in France or in Prague, for that matter. In Mexico, a lot of blood and violence is tolerated. But in the U.S., the pictures of the dead Taliban, for instance, from 1997, were not published. I mean, it's not that they have an aversion to blood and gore, but you know, you push the limit, and certainly now in Syria, that's what's happening with pictures that do come out of there, particularly around the hospitals. It's tough to look at, and a lot of editors don't want the negativity of a theme. They want solutions. But what can you show in Syria, for instance? You can show all sides now in Afghanistan, and yet still people are struggling to find the spectacular and the goriest, but that doesn't necessarily get people's attention. There's fatigue for that kind of an image, too.
Yeah, there's one question here. That's right.
Bob, going back to your point about remaining engaged, taking the example you gave earlier of the 1991 lowering of the American flag, and then the shift to Iraq, which obviously wasn't remaining engaged in either case. What makes you think the U.S. or any foreign power really has the desire to really remain engaged, or even if they can, whether that is a solution for a foreign power to be able to solve this very complex situation?
Well, you know, the Americans left their embassy unoccupied for 10 years from that flag coming down. Look what sprung up, not just, you know, weeds. It was a serious mistake. And in 2002, when they had already decided to go to Iraq, that was another mess that the Afghans didn't feel very happy about. But it sent a signal to the countries in the area that they could funnel things in, smuggling picked up, heroin moved faster, weapons moved around. And I just think you have to be more realistic about, a vacuum is going to bring in perhaps the wrong people. And the Taliban, while it's a franchised organization right now, as well as Al-Qaeda, they're going to take advantage of that. And I'm just a little bit leery. I don't want to have to go back there and cover another 10 years of chaos. I mean, look, Afghanistan is the perfect thing. It's the perfect mix of chaos and content for a journalist. But at some point in time, it's just going to be too risky.
Yeah, but my point is, what foreign power really wants to be engaged? Do we care, really?
What do you do in your diplomatic or foreign ministries but train people to go into these countries and try to stand firm and reconstruct or advise or at least observe properly? And if those people aren't out there, then it's going to turn into a vacuum. And I think the region, Pakistan for one thing, is very happy to create chaos in another area, insecurity in one area for its own security. I'm a little bit concerned about that personally. I mean, Lashkar-e-Taiba now wants to be the new Al-Qaeda. And Karachi is, we were talking about this earlier, Pakistan is extremely volatile. But if we pull out of there, it's just going to become more and more chaotic. So I do think that some commitment has to be made. I'm just reminding you of what can happen if you disengage.
And are you following the debate in Washington? Have you got a feel for whether that engagement will stop, actually? Because there are many people...
It's an election year, so a lot of things can be said. But I think there is an understanding that Karzai is really playing this out for his own purposes at the moment, political legacy. But I don't think the military wants to disengage completely.
So they'll wait until after Karzai?
Yes.
Before they work out where they are? Yeah.
So interesting you're saying that it's just going to be too dangerous soon to go there. I mean, with the Swedish...
Possibly too dangerous.
Possibly too dangerous. And also the attack on Taverna recently. I mean, are we looking... are we looking at a shift in focus to foreign targets? Is it just going to be too dangerous for foreigners to live there fairly soon? I mean, what do you think is going to happen in terms of the expat community living in Kabul?
Well, the NGO community is certainly going to have to withdraw because they can't rely on anybody for security, and that they have to make long-term plans, 2 to 3 years, about how they're going to staff a place. I mean, last year, ICRC was hit in Jalalabad. Their base, their clinics were hit. The people from MSF and the ICRC in Kabul left the country. Now, that's a 5-hour drive, 4-hour drive. Why did Kabul leave after Jalalabad was hit? I mean, who makes those decisions? They do. But without foreigners there to give them adequate protection or a UN security force there, it's going to be hard to make a commitment on humanitarian efforts. So they're all talking to each other. They're worried about a certain level of protection, but MSF people don't go out to a restaurant, but maybe once a week. They have to stay in their compound. Who'd want to go there? I mean, as a humanitarian aid worker.
Yep, there's another comment here, yep.
Hi, Bob. Sorry, I just want to take the photographer back to photography again. The picture you showed of Kamlesh, the 2 wounded US soldiers in the back of the truck. If we look around here, we've got Turnley's famous photograph of wounded soldiers learning about death of friends. Out in the hallway, we've got Larry Burroughs' pictures of wounded soldiers in Vietnam. I've spent a lot of time working in Afghanistan, and I know that the American administration tried to make it impossible to photograph wounded US servicemen. You had to get forms filled out and get permission. And I heard lots of people saying this is another part of the problem with the embedding process. It's a waste of time. You can't do this, you can't do that. But I photograph wounded guys and you photograph wounded guys. Can you talk about, how you got around rules, when you decided to obey them, when you decided to wriggle, how you built relationships, how you get past the paperwork and actually do your job?
I mean, obviously, it depends on who's controlling the base that you land in. And they want to know what you're doing and see if they have a certain element of trust involved, or you're going to be an asset or a liability. Or if you're a liability, they do consider it in a very Machiavellian way, you're a liability. You don't carry a weapon. You're here to watch what we're doing. We may not want you to see everything, yet you're going to find a way to do it. Because you know what happens when you tell a journalist they can't go in that door. They go in that door. But in this particular case, I did not have to ask those wounded soldiers for their permission to use it. I had a pretty good relationship with the main public affairs officer, down in Jalalabad. It wasn't an issue. I held that picture for a long time. Not long enough, really, maybe to make them happy. But Iraq and Afghanistan had good points and bad points as far as monitoring journalists, and sometimes it was easy. You tested, but you also knew that if you came across a destroyed vehicle, for instance, that was about the last thing you wanted to send home quickly to run, because that would give the enemy an idea of their capacity to blow up a 15-ton vehicle. So you didn't put that out right away. And I know of journalists that have been thrown out for doing that. That's a mistake. You wait till you're out of there before you try to upload and publish a picture like that. So you know their tolerance is up to a certain point. But there is a chance you're going to get tossed. And it happened to me working with the New York Times in Iraq. But this is a completely different story. And a lot of different influences. After 96 hours, we ran a picture that somebody got very upset about. We were perfectly within our agreement to run that picture. It just went way out of control. But that's never happened to me.
Picture was?
A wounded soldier who was mortally wounded at the time, and then he eventually died. But how are you going to get a permission from a mortally wounded soldier? Yet we waited the proper amount of time for the family was notified. The family was furious for other reasons, not about our competency. But you do now have to get permission from a wounded soldier to run that picture. And it's an issue. But so you have to figure out when you're going to run that picture. Wait. But in this case, I knew the tolerance of the Eastern headquarters. He's still a friend of mine, by the way, and works in CENTCOM. So some of the public affairs people that you deal with, you remain in contact with, and they're interesting people.
Any more questions? Yes, there's one there. Yeah.
Hello, I'm a journalist, and I've made an editorial observation, and that has to do with the montage that you projected. It's wonderful, really brilliant pictures. Thank you very much. My question to you is this. 75% of the Afghan population consists of farmers who struggle to make ends meet, let alone be politically motivated. They were not represented there. Do you find them uninteresting, or did they not make it to the projection? There were a few pictures of civilians, but I think they were the ones that I would say, to a Western perspective, sort of stand out as the exotic view of the East, as it were. But the second question also is, how did you get Haqqani to sit for you? Also, since we've got a lot of journalists here, can I make a plea of the use of the word madrasa? I speak Farsi. Madrasa means school. And a lot of us who do speak Farsi find it rather irritating every time the word is used to mean a religious schooling. A religious schooling is a religious schooling. Madrasa means simply school. So could I ask you all not to use the word madrasa to mean a religious schooling? It doesn't. It basically means a school. Thank you.
Fair enough. There's a farmer on the cover of the book. I mean, I don't know what I can do really more for that, but I also spend a lot of time in urban areas, not rural areas. And it's often the case that I don't get what I feel to be a very natural situation in an urban area versus a rural area. If I don't feel that it's strong enough, I'm not going to include it in the book just to have sort of that balance that you're asking about. That's a decision that I made. if there's one weakness for me, it's the number of women in the book, and I just don't have that much access to 50% of the population are female. But as far as how did I get Haqqani, I asked Jalaluddin Haqqani if he would sit for me. And this was on the same trip where we were also looking for Kashmiri militants being trained by him. That was the trip. I visited him a couple of times. Sorry?
He was very reluctant to be photographed in the past. It was one of the sort of major problems that I think anyone that dealt with television and photos had when it came to Haqqani. He wouldn't sit photos. So it's impressive that you managed to get him to sit for you.
There's one question here.
Sitting in that chair was the photographer who was with Claire Colvin when she died. And the first call he had was from David Cameron. How often do you have the CIA and NSA and people from our government try to, in some way, co-opt you, find out what you know? You say you're silent as a photographer. Do you have to talk sometimes?
Only if there's food and liquor available. And I did often go in the mid-90s over to the Turkish embassy, which was one of the few that remained open during the Civil War. And we did have an equal trade of information. Particularly, they were interested about the Uzbek, the more Turkic tribes of the north and the west. They were very interested in Dostum. We had just come back from a trip to visit Dostum. And the ambassador was a great jazz piano player. So, I mean, there's certainly advantages that you leverage, you know. Thank God they let us stay for dinner, you know. That was the best meal I had in a month. But NSA, I mean, look, when I moved to India in 1988, the Indian intelligence was on my phone constantly whenever I made an over. I could hear the reel-to-reel tape machine in the background. It was hilarious. They were talking in the background as I'm making a call to an editor in New York. So the whole phone tapping for me is a big deal. I mean, not to belittle it for other people in privacy, but I've been exposed to that for a long time. And also our hotel rooms were often ransacked by the intelligence agencies and local in Pakistan. So I have a different perspective than what you're asking about. I'm not troubled by it. They're doing their work, you know, and if they want to know about what I'm up to, I still have the image that they haven't seen yet.
So, okay, quick couple of questions. We're going to run out of time shortly, but let's get these. Yep, at the back. That's fine, yep.
Yeah, it's very short. Do I gather from what you're saying that you wouldn't be going back to cover the elections? Do you think it's going to get much worse? I'm over here. Hi.
Sorry.
Would I be right in assuming you're not going to go back to cover the elections
I'm not.
in the aftermath?
I've done an election too much, you know, actually. It's hard to work, and it's not a lot. There's not much gratification for me after doing elections in South Asia for decades. I'll wait till it's over. But I am having the book translated into Farsi, and I will deliver that back at some point this summer, hopefully.
And the Swedish journalist, there's no way of knowing why they picked on him, whether it was just he was, well, what, is there any knowing?
I don't. John McEwen mentioned that he was going to this restaurant to perhaps meet somebody, but I don't know anything more.
Yeah. And one more at the back, yeah.
Hi, Bob. Just maybe to digress a little bit, you'd mentioned you started off in El Salvador, and which at the time was a very bloody place and newsworthy. And yet this week we've seen the FMLN be elected to the presidency, and a big article by William Walker, which was sort of a mea culpa for the involvement there. So do you have any thoughts on the necessity of intervention or the folly of intervention? And you know, do you sort of dwell on comparing those sort of situations that are, you know, two countries that are obviously important to you?
El Salvador. Well, one of the leaders in the early 80s of the strongest guerrilla group came from the aristocracy. I mean, their family owned a car dealership. And these people eventually cycled back through power. And I think a more interesting country to compare Afghanistan to, it might be Guatemala than El Salvador. I don't know really, I have no desire to go back to El Salvador personally. It's a lot rougher with the gangs and people the U.S. has deported. It's something that the United States has priorities in Latin America. I don't follow it that closely anymore, really, but I don't know if you can compare the two.
Okay, can I just ask, before we wrap up, for the publisher, the people who are looking after the books, perhaps can come up to the front and prepare themselves for their rapid sales. And I do have just one last question to you. I mean, you've done this extraordinary 30-year body of work. Has it made a difference?
To a certain degree, it kept the public informed a little bit. I mean, because we do a story doesn't guarantee movement in any one particular direction, but at least I hope people it and a particular conflict, as conflicts resolve themselves, that we don't forget really the past.
I expected a modest answer, and that's what we got. So there it is. I hope you take advantage of that being here and will join me in thanking Bob for an absolutely excellent hour.